In this video, we're going to continue on our journey of learning how to do those basic CRUD operations with our movie rating application. So we've covered reading, and now we want to cover deleting, updating, and creating. So I think we'll start with deleting. And the way we're going to set up deleting is that our movie component here has a delete icon that's been turned into a button, and when we click on it, we want to actually delete that element from our database. So last time we set up our movie listing component, which talked to our database using useEffect, and by the end of that effect, we had some data that we could loop over and put into our movie components. So to start with, we want to just be in our movie component. So I'm going to close these other tabs. And this movie component, it has a button here with a delete component inside of it. And so for context, these are coming from a library called Material UI. Material UI, it's a popular React framework that implements Google's Material UI design system. And if you look through it, it comes with a bunch of components that you can bring in. Like it has buttons that are styled using Google's sort of suggested ripple effects. It has switches, it has sliders. So if you're building an application, bringing in a design system like Material UI can be really helpful. And the nice thing about this library is that if I click on any of the source code here, it's all React based. So this is a React implementation of Material UI. And so this is a lot to bring in that we're not actually using. We're actually just using, if I search for icon here, the material icons. So the material icons, if I start up at the top, it's telling me that it's bringing in Google's material icons in a package for us to use. And if I click on this first link, it takes me to a search where I can look through all the icons. So I brought in the delete icon and I brought in the edit icon, but there's a whole bunch of other ones. So if you're looking in your application to do something different, like maybe you need a button to refresh and like look for new data, or you have a button that does some kind of saving, you can search through here for different icons. Like even as I'm looking at it, I can see that there's a favorite button that instead of emoji, we could have used this in our application to display the ratings. So this previous page tells us how to use the icons that we can import from Material UI/icons and then into the curly brackets for our named imports. We just grab one of these names. So if I wanted favorite border, I would import favorite border from Material UI icons. And that's what I've done already up here. I pulled in the delete and edit. These are SVG icons that are loaded on the page. The styling has been set up for us already ahead of time by me inside of this CSS. So you can dive into here if you're curious about anything. And back in movie, what we want to do is kind of focus on some of the logic around this delete button. So this component, when we click on the delete button, this function will run. And into this function, we can use our ID to tell our Firestore database, get rid of the document that has this ID. And this is the type of thing that we can do inside of React. But what I highly encourage everyone to do when they're working through the Firestore API is work out the logic just without React involved at all. Make sure that you know how to do what you're trying to do. Like here, I want to delete something. So we're going to go to index.js. We're going to make sure we know how to delete a document. And then we are going to bring that into React. So we're figuring out how it works in isolation. And then now that we know that it's working, we can work on the integration with React. If you try and do both of those simultaneously, you may end up with bugs that either come from your usage of Firestore or your React integration, and then it's harder to kind of pin down what's going wrong. So I'm going to flip over to index, and I am going to bring in the movies collection by starting to type it and then hit tab to get the auto import. If that doesn't work, just make sure that you're importing it manually up here. And then I'm going to grab my handy documentation for Cloud Firestore, and under add and manage data, there is a page for deleting data. And I recommend reading this whole page, but the bit that we're going to do is this, where db.collection gives us a collection reference. And once we have a collection reference, we can say doc and pass in the key for the document to get a document reference. And then we can call the delete method on it. And if we look back at the API documentation and we look at a document reference, as soon as we have a document reference, which is this reference that points to a document's location inside of our database, we can call the delete method. And this delete method gives us a promise that resolves to nothing. So void means there's no value that returns from this promise. So we're just going to wait for this promise to resolve and check that there's no error when we try and do our delete. Before we dive back into the code, it's useful to take a peek at what these other things are on the delete page. So if we have something in our database and we want to delete a field, remove a field, you could pass in null, or you could pass in undefined, or what you can do is tell Firebase to just get rid of that field by passing in the value returned from this path. So we're going into Firestore and we're asking for the sort of value of a delete field. We talked about delete collections, which you don't really want to do from the web API. And then down here, there's a little note that you can delete things from the console. So we can always go in here and we can delete a specific document or fields from the document, or we can delete a collection. Okay, so let's zoom back up to the top. We're going to do this deleting of a specific document. So we need to go into our collection, say .doc to get a document reference, and then delete it. And I'm going to grab Logan here, and I'm going to select and copy with Control-C this key so that I can paste it back in here. So I've got my movie collection, which gives me the .doc method that allows me to get a document reference. So I could call this doc reference. And if I call the doc reference .delete, this is what gives me back a promise. So anytime we're doing promises, it's useful to have an async function that we're doing those in. So we could create a function delete movie. We will mark it as async. Bring our logic into this function. Make sure that we wrap it in a try. And have a catch for any errors. And when we have our promise here, we can await it. So normally when you have a promise that resolves to some value, you would say, something equals await our promise. But in this case, delete doesn't actually resolve to a specific value. It resolves to void. So we don't actually have to capture anything over here. We can just say await doc reference .delete. And when we catch our error, let's console log that error. And save it. So now if I were to run our delete movie method and save, anytime our page runs, that document should be deleted from our collection if I've coded this correctly. So actually, because I have hot reloading enabled with our Create React app, which comes along for free, this page actually refreshed as soon as I hit Control S in here. So it did already delete from our database. So I no longer see that first movie with this key that we had here, 3QY No 3QY in here anymore. And let's see what happens if I refresh the page so that delete runs again. So it looks like this happened. Let's just throw a console.log in so that we can see something printing out. So if it runs successfully, we will see console log delete. And if it errors, we'll see that error print out. And we can see that when we try to delete something that doesn't even exist, it successfully completes, even though you might have expected there to be an error. So that's useful for us to keep in mind that if I typed in, I made a typo with the key or the ID here, Firebase is happily telling us that, yeah, you deleted that. That's no longer in the database. So reasons why you might get an error is if the user, like something happened with their network connection, or if the security rules that were configured for your database said that the user wasn't allowed to delete something. That might be where we would end up catching one of those errors. So let's make sure that this is working again. Let's grab the alien key here. So double click to copy that. And let's put these side by side so that we can see this running. I am going into my movie collection, doc, pasting this in, hitting Control S to save. My page reloads. Alien is gone. Delete prints out. And if I check out my database, Alien is now not in this database anymore. So at this point, we have figured out how to delete using the docs, using the API reference, without having to do anything with React. So now that we know how to do this, we can bring this JavaScript over to our React component and start working on integrating it. We know this code works, so if we have errors, it's likely to be with the React integration when we start bringing this over. So knowing that this works gives us a nice confidence boost. And helps us with debugging. So I'm going to copy this, save this file, head back over to my movie. I'm going to paste this in, comment it out so that we have it for reference, but we're going to retype it ourselves into this delete movie function. And one other thing that I want to do before we get started here is uncomment my load sample data, save this, and flip back to the browser, refresh my page, and get those movies back. So this will give us a nice clean starting point so that when we delete things, we don't end up having 0 movies with nothing to delete. So I can uncomment this, and anytime you need in your project to get back to that sample data state, you just uncomment this, refresh the page, and then comment it out again. Okay, so we're back into our delete movie. And the thing that we have to do with this delete movie is going to be very similar to what we did with having a flow for adding movies or having a flow for loading the movies. Because this is asynchronous, when you click the button, like here, pretend this is the delete button, that's going to take some time. So we have to trigger something over in Firebase, and while that's happening, we should display some loading information. And then when that resolves, we will do one thing if it's successful and do another thing if there's an error. So let's flip back here and look at our setup before we start implementing this logic. So I've already created 2 pieces of state. We have is deleting, which is a Boolean, and we have error message, which starts out as an empty string. So when we click on that delete button, we can flip this Boolean to true, which will allow us to, down here, disable the button so that someone can't mash delete multiple times while it's trying to delete. And we could also use that if we needed to display a message. Like if we didn't have this button here and we just, instead of this icon, we had something that said delete inside the button. When we are deleting, we could change that to say is deleting. So there's small things that we could do to kind of indicate that something is happening, that this is deleting in the background. And then we have this spot in our movie card that will, if there is an error message, display that error message into the card. So if I were to mock this up and say, error, could not delete, try again. This is already set up so that that message shows up here. And let's also, so we can get rid of this, and let's flip our is deleting to true. So this button is now disabled. So if we were to click on it, it would no longer generate the click event. So that we can see that, let's actually do, like, we'll do an alert for testing here. Deleting. And we'll start off with is deleting is false. So I click it, I'm allowed to delete. And then as soon as we flip this to true, which down here is equivalent to saying disabled is true, means that button can no longer trigger its events. So now when I click on it, nothing pops up. And you know what? While we're at it, let's improve the user interface. Let's actually make something change about the user interface. So this button has a class name of movie button. If I go into movie.css and I look for that movie button, I can add a new state here, use a pseudo selector here to say disabled, disabled. So now we're styling the button only when it's in that disabled state. We could say something like opacity is 0.75. And if I check it out, now that button is dimmed out. Maybe let's reduce that a little bit. Let's try like 0.6. Yeah, that's not bad. So when we click on it, it'll go into that dimmed state as long as it's disabled. And if I were to, we could use our components to kind of look at that, and let's inspect this first one. So get this movie. This first piece of state is that state that controls whether it's deleting. So if I flip that to false, we can see, now the button should work. And if I flip this to true, it'll flip into its default state, and now that button will no longer work. Okay, so let's save this. Flip this back to false because we're not deleting. And now we can work on our logic of taking this into our delete movie function. So let's get rid of this alert. As soon as we start this, we know that we are attempting to delete, so we can set is deleting to be true, which even this we should be able to test. If I flip back to the browser and click on one of these, now that one is in its deleting state. Click on some of these others, they're now in their deleting states. Let's get rid of any error messages. So we're kind of just resetting the state before we go ahead and do our try catch. Let's do the error first, where we can console.error. And remember, this is just for us as developers when we're inspecting the site. If we see an error, we can pop over the console and we can actually see what went wrong. But then for our users, we are going to set this error message state. So set error message and say something went wrong while deleting. Please try again. Then into our try, we can do our logic here. So we can get a document reference. So I'll call that docref. And we're going to use movies collection. And I'm going to have to make sure that I import movies collection. So up here, import movies collection from, whoops, that is a lowercase m, our data folder Firebase. So data movies collection dot doc, and then into here we need to pass our specific identifier for our document. And remember that this, when we in MovieListing looped over those document references or document snapshots that we got back, we were able to grab the ID and we passed that in as an ID prop here. So when we go to delete, we can use the ID prop that we declared up here. So .doc, .id, and then await .ref.delete. And when we're done, we can set is deleting to be false. So if we give this a try here, I should be able to delete Alien. So I've clicked delete. The thing that we're seeing here is that the movie didn't go away. So what I'm going to do is refresh the page and see that Alien is now gone. And if I look at my database, Alien is gone from that database. So the thing that's happening here is that we are successfully deleting something from the database. I click this, witches is gone from the database. None of these are witches. But our movie listing doesn't update. So we're going to have to refactor that a little bit to get all of this working. But I want to make one change that will help us like future-proof this a little bit. When we go ahead and delete this movie, that means the card is going to disappear by the time we get to this promise resolving. So this line of code would be changing the state on a component that no longer exists on the page. Because as soon as we finish deleting, this movie should disappear from the page. And that's not something you want to do. So what we probably want to do is move this into our catch. So if this resolved properly, there's no need to change the state because this movie component will be removed from the page. But if there's an error, then we want to set the error message and then reset the state so that the user could try clicking the is deleting button one more time. So this should still function the same. If I refresh the page, try deleting a few of these, refresh the page again, should be able to delete them. We just have this extra step of refreshing the page. So what I want to do, get rid of this comment. And before we continue working, I'm going to go into index, load the sample data, give my page a refresh so that that runs, and we get all of our sample data back so that we could do some more deleting without running out of movies. And then I'm going to comment this out, save it, and go back to my movie listing. So this is where we're going to have to make some modifications. So we did our deleting. We learned our docref.delete, but we're actually coming back to read. And what we did the first time was do get, which allowed us to have a collection reference that we got all of the documents within that collection. We now want to do collection reference.onSnapshot, which will allow us to get the collection reference when the component mounts, but also be notified anytime that collection changes, which would happen when we do a delete. So when we click delete, that should change the collection, and we want this page to be notified about that. So I'm going to go to our page here for reading data. We did get data once. We now want to listen for real-time updates. The structure is a little bit different here. Give this a second to load. This is not loading. Okay, there we go. A promise is a thing that runs and then resolves or rejects. So it's good for loading things once. But when it comes time for real-time listeners, a promise isn't really a good fit because when we're listening for real-time updates, we need to be notified many times when something changes. And so the structure that we're going to use here is often called a callback function. So when we get a collection or a document, we can call onSnapshot, and we're going to pass in a function that is going to run anytime, whatever we specified, collection or document changes, and we'll be given back that document data. So we're not going to need to deal with promises for this flavor of listening to the database, and that's because we need a structure that can run multiple times, which promises aren't built for. So this is a very simple version that's listening to a specific document for changes, and the document is passed in to our function so that you could use it for something. If I scroll past these sections, well, actually, this is a good one to stop at. You can call onSnapshot on your documents and on your collections. So here, this example is listening for the collection, and specifically it's listening for states that are in California. But you don't have to have this where clause. We could just say db.collectionsmovies.onSnapshot and get notified with a query snapshot anytime that the collection changes. So we're going to be using code that's more similar to this. And they've got an example here that shows you how to listen to like what specific fields were changed, which can be useful for some applications. The thing that I want to point out is detaching a listener. So when you call onSnapshot, that is going to set up this function to run forever, listening for data to change. The way that you can say, okay, it's time to stop listening, is that when you call this onSnapshot from a collection, it returns back to you a function, unsubscribe, that you can call to stop this from running. So we will set up our listener to listen forever for these snapshots, and then when our movies listing component is unmounted, is removed from the page, we will call unsubscribe, which will stop it from running. And then this next bit here is talking about errors. So it's always good for us to handle errors. And in our promise land, we were using try catch for catching those errors. In our new callback structure for handling things, there are actually two ways that we can set up for listening to errors. But one is that when you pass something into onSnapshot, you can pass your listener for success first, which gets your snapshot. And then second, you can pass in a separate function that gets called when errors occur. Okay, so let's bring some of this over. Let's get our listings set up for real-time updates. I'm going to leave the code that we had before in here, but comment it out. And I'm going to say that this is method 1 of reading the database. Read once. Or we'll say read only once. And then below it, we can say method 2 of reading the database, listening for real-time updates. And like we did with delete, I want to make sure that I am actually testing this logic outside of React. And then we'll come back into React and bring it in here. So if I go to index.js, I'm going to work out the code here using my movies collection. So movies collection, which is a collection reference, has this onSnapshot method. So I can say .onSnapshot and give it a function while we're at it, let's pull up the documentation page for that. So when we did movies collection here, that was a collection reference. So I'm going to head to the collection reference page. I am going to look for the on snapshot function here, and we're going to try parsing out the documentation here, which is a little bit more complicated than documentation we've seen before, but not too crazy once we spend some time with it. So let's actually, this syntax is really compressed up here, but down here it actually has them broken out. So we can see that it's sort of describing to us that the first parameter we pass in can be this object that has a complete callback, so a function that runs when it's complete, a callback when there's an error, and a callback when the next piece of data, the next update has been returned. And we can see down here that it says it returns a function that doesn't return anything, but this is our unsubscribe function. And if we keep scrolling down, we're actually seeing on snapshot multiple times. And so each time, this is referred to overloading, is a slightly different version that has different parameters. So this version of on snapshot is taking a, whoops, didn't mean to click on that. Let's go back. Is taking in an object in the parentheses here and is returning an unsubscribe function. If I scroll down, this one takes options and then has that observer as the next parameter and then returns an unsubscribe. And if I go down, we can see this one takes a function on next and then a function that runs when there's an error, and then a function on completion. So this is the most similar to the examples we saw in the documentation page, where you could pass in a function first and then another function for handling those errors. And if we go down, is that the last one we've got here? No. We've got another one that takes options, on next, on error, on completion, and that was the last one. So we're going to go to this one that is most similar to the documentation page that we saw, which was down here where we saw they passed in two functions. So the first function is on next, and what we can see here in this syntax, it's saying that it's a function that gets a snapshot passed to it, and it doesn't return anything. And we can see error on error here. We have a function that in the parentheses gets an error and returns nothing. And if we look through the documentation, it can tell us a little bit more. Like it's got this note that even though you can pass in on completion, it doesn't actually do anything because snapshots are never ending. So using this, we're going to pass in an on next function and an on error function. So we'll create them up here, const on next and const on error. And then we pass them in on next, on error. The on next gets a snapshot and the on error gets an error. So we could console.error, our error that comes in, if there is one. And our snapshot here, because we're asking for a collection, is going to be a collection snapshot. So let's go back to the docs and figure out with our, or sorry, not a collection snapshot. We can see here that it's a query snapshot. So if I click on that, we can check out, we've got a docs property, which gives us all the documents in there, a size property, empty. We can loop over using for each. So let's just print out the size maybe. So console.log snapshot.size. Okay, so this, as soon as the page loads, sets up our handlers here on next and on error to run on the movie collection. So we should see when the page loads, it pulls something for the first time. So we see the number 7. And then anytime we delete something, that number should change. So if I were to go back to my console and grab one of these documents, like before sunrise, delete that document, come back, we can see this ran again, and we got 6. And if I delete another one, delete the witches, our function ran again and now prints out 5. And I can tell that this is from index.js. So we now have a function that's constantly being updated by our Firestore here. And I know that this returns to me an unsubscribe function. So if I were to, like, let's do this. I'm going to set a timeout. And I'm going to say in 5 seconds, in 5 seconds, call unsubscribe. So when our page loads, it's going to be listening for 5 seconds for changes and printing out those changes. But after 5 seconds, it's going to be finished because we've called this unsubscribe. And maybe to make this clearer, let's do this. So this will now run this arrow function after 5 seconds that runs unsubscribe and prints out unsubscribe. I just changed it so that we could see something printing out. So if I save this, go back, wait 5 seconds. Oh, whoops. Let's try that one more time. I think it had already unsubscribed by the time I flipped back to the browser. So here, waiting 5 seconds, unsubscribed. So if I were to refresh this, go back to my database, delete one of these within the 5 seconds, and come back, we can see 4 printed out, just barely, and then my unsubscribed printed out, which means that if I go back to my database and go ahead and delete one more, nothing prints out after the unsubscribe. So that's the logic we want. We want, when we go to this all movies page, let's subscribe to those updates. But as soon as we leave and try to go to another page, let us unsubscribe so that we're not getting updates when we're on the add page or the edit page. So at this point, we have worked out all of our logic. We just need to bring this over to React. So what I'm going to do is cut this from this file. I'm going to reload my sample data. So uncomment that. Refresh the page so that that sample data gets injected. Now we can comment out the sample data, go to our movie listing, and start working on method 2. And I'm going to paste this in for reference, and we'll sort of uncomment things as we are going and as we're ready for them. So when this use effect runs, we still need to set loading. So we're going to say, let's do this down here. Set is loading to true. Same thing that we're doing up here. We want to make sure that loading when our component is mounted is true. And then when we get our first snapshot back from this subscription, we can go ahead and say, oh, we're done. We're no longer loading. So we can get rid of this set timeout. We don't need that in this code. Let's do our we're creating our on snapshot here, and we have our functions here that are running when we get some data back for on next and on error. So when we get data back, we can say set is loading false and give this a save. So if I were to go back to my page, what I should see is that the loading shows up for a split second and then disappears once we get our data. So showed up for a split second and then disappeared. And so what we need to do now that we've got the snapshot is this logic that we were doing up here. So we have our docs, which is equal to snapshot.docs, and then we set the movies to our docs. So now it should load grab the docs, throw them on the page like we had before. And we can make sure that we handle our errors in a similar way. So I'm going to grab my error message and paste it in here. And maybe for the sake of reading this, I will move the set is loading up here, even though it was fine where we had it. So we're setting loading, we are turning off loading, we're making sure we set the movies, we're making sure we set the error. And that should, if we take a quick look up here, replicate everything that we had going on up here. We're going to come back and fix the unsubscribe in a second. But this should work. Now, if I go to the page and I go delete something, let's test it from here. So if I delete something from the console and then come back, it's disappeared from the page. But the magic now is that because we had that delete function built in here, if I click on any of these, now it deletes and our movie listing updates because it's listening for those real-time updates. Now, the problem comes in if I leave this page and go to another page and then delete something. We're getting an error that React can't perform an update on an unmounted component. And that's because our movie listing, this is still subscribed. We never called unsubscribe. So we're getting that error that when we're on this other page, our on next still ran and we still tried to set is loading and we still tried to set movies on a component that no longer was on the page. The easy fix for this is inside of an effect. So we're in an effect here. I'm going to delete this temporarily so that we can see that we're in this effect and we have our function that is running as our side effect. If you return something, this is the function that React will call when the effect is being unloaded. So in our case, this effect runs when the component mounts, and then it will call unsubscribe when the component is unmounted. So if I save this, I go to my movie listing, I go to add movie, and I go delete something. No error. We're no longer trying to update that movie listing. So it's really important to make sure that we clean up our side effects by returning the function that should be used to do the cleanup. So let me get back that comment. And let's wrap up this video and this code. So what we did here, we did a number of things, but looking back at our CRUD cheat sheet, we have learned delete, which then required us to kind of update our knowledge of read. So we knew how to get data once, and now we know how to get data in real time. So this is really helpful in applications that require real-time communication, like if you're building a chat app or a multiplayer game where you want people to be interacting live with each other. Listening to your collections and your documents this way, you will be able to create that real-time interactivity. In our case, the reason why we needed it is because we have this page that is loaded and the data is changing while we're on that page. So we can't just retrieve it once. We have to know every time that data is changed. And that's where we went from our single fetch to our slightly more complicated callback-based listening. But if you just sort of step through it and spend time with it, it will eventually make the same amount of sense as those promises did. So here we have a function that is called every time we get new data, and there's a function that's called when we get an error. Okay, so I'm going to end the video here, and in the next video we will pick up and start looking at creating and updating data.